In the golden-hued suburbs of an upscale East Coast neighborhood, Nina Thompson faced the kind of heartbreaking decision that changes a woman's life forever. When Ronald, her beloved father-in-law, passed away that autumn, the shadows of grief fell heavily upon their family mansion's pristine walls. Driven by compassion and an unshakable belief in family bonds, Nina made a choice that would soon turn her perfectly ordered world upside down. She invited her mother-in-law, Susan, to live with them. But oh, how quickly comfort can turn to torment, and dreams can transform into living nightmares. The endless criticism, the suffocating control, and her husband Evan's passive silence began to slowly crush Nina's spirit like a delicate flower beneath a crystal paperweight. Then fate, with its cruel sense of timing, brought an unexpected encounter with a face from her past. A man who made her question everything she had sacrificed in the name of family duty. How far would you go to reclaim your freedom? The question echoed in her heart like a forbidden whisper. Could she find the strength to reclaim the life that was slowly slipping through her fingers like grains of sand? Nina's heart ached with uncertainty, torn between duty and desire, between the woman she had become and the woman she longed to be. Ronald's death had left a void in their lives as vast as the summer sky, a darkness that seemed to swallow their once happy home. He had been their foundation, their rock, the glue that held their family together with gentle strength and unwavering wisdom. For Susan, his devoted wife of 40 years, the loss carved an emptiness so profound it seemed to hollow out her very soul. She wandered their family home like a ghost, lost in memories of a life now forever changed. Nina's grief, though different, ran just as deep. For Ronald had been the father figure she had always yearned for, showing her the kind of respect and tenderness that Susan had never once offered. Yet when Susan suggested moving in with them, Nina saw it as a chance for redemption, a way to heal old wounds and forge new bonds. After all, Susan stood before them, vulnerable and alone, a proud woman brought low by circumstances beyond her control. Through her own tears, Nina convinced herself that this decision could be the bridge they needed, a way to strengthen the delicate threads that bound their family together. Evan, her husband of 5 years, had always maintained an unusually close relationship with his mother, perhaps too close, though Nina pushed that thought aside. Having Susan with them seemed like the perfect solution. A way to help both mother and son navigate their grief while healing the rifts that had always existed between the women of the family. Nina dreamed that by welcoming Susan into their home, they might not only ease the sharp edges of loss but also finally smooth the rough waters of their relationship. The history between them had always been complicated, a dance of tension and forced politeness that exhausted Nina's generous spirit. Despite her constant efforts to please her mother-in-law, Susan remained demanding, critical, and sometimes overwhelmingly authoritarian. On that fateful gray afternoon, as Susan arrived with her designer luggage and carefully maintained appearance, Nina had prepared their guest suite with all the care of a woman desperate to make things work. She arranged fresh flowers, pressed the finest linens, and prepared Susan's favorite pot roast, hoping these small gestures might finally win her mother-in-law's approval. At first, the evening unfolded like a scene from a perfect family movie. They shared memories of Ronald over dinner, their laughter mixing with tears of remembrance. For one brief, shining moment, Nina dared to hope that Susan's presence might actually bring the comfort and healing they all so desperately needed. But that peace proved as fragile as morning frost in sunshine, melting away to reveal the cold reality beneath. Susan's controlling nature emerged like a tide rolling in, subtle at first but soon impossible to ignore. What had once been casual conversations about household matters transformed into an endless stream of criticism directed at Nina's every move. Susan watched her daughter-in-law like a hawk, swooping in to correct everything from the arrangement of kitchen cabinets to the way Nina folded the laundry. Ronald always preferred the china displayed this way, dear, Susan would say, her voice dripping with honey-coated venom as Nina prepared dinner. I worry about Evan, he works so hard, and yet. The unfinished sentence hung in the air like a sword, implying Nina's failures as a wife. At first, Nina tried to let these comments roll off her back like water from a duck's feathers. But gradually, the weight of Susan's judgment began to press down on her shoulders like a heavy winter coat she couldn't remove. Everything that didn't meet Susan's exacting standards became fodder for her sharp-tongued observations. Day by day, like a queen claiming her throne, Susan tightened her grip on the household, treating Nina's cherished home as if it were her own private domain. Nina found herself paralyzed between respect for her mother-in-law's grief and the suffocating reality of her growing dominance. Though she tried to maintain her dignity through respectful silence, Nina felt her spirit crumbling like a sandcastle against the rising tide of Susan's control. There was no respite, no moment of peace in what had once been her sanctuary. Even a simple afternoon shopping trip became an ordeal, with Susan lying in wait like a spider in her web. "The house has fallen into complete chaos while you were gone," Susan would announce, her voice sharp as winter frost. "How irresponsible of you to leave everything in such a state." The words would slice through the air like daggers. The atmosphere in the house grew as heavy as thunder clouds before a storm, making it difficult for Nina to even breathe. With growing horror, Nina realized that her beautiful home had become nothing more than a gilded cage, with Susan holding the key. But these criticisms were merely the opening act in Susan's grand performance of control. Soon, she began orchestrating every aspect of Nina and Evan's married life like a demanding theater director. Any plans the couple made were swiftly countered with Susan's alternative suggestions, always accompanied by subtle hints of her feeling excluded. Even Evan, despite his usually loving nature, seemed helpless against his mother's masterful manipulation. Each time Susan uttered the words, "When Ronald was alive," Nina felt her patience being tested like a thread stretched to its breaking point. Then came the final blow, as shocking as a bolt from the blue. After several weeks of living together, Susan made an unprecedented demand, as outrageous as it was calculated. "Since I'm doing so much to maintain this household," she declared, "I expect a monthly contribution of $500 for my services. It's only fair, considering how I keep this house running properly," Susan insisted, her voice dripping with entitlement. Nina stood frozen, her heart pounding like a trapped bird against her ribcage. In that moment, she saw with crystal clarity that Susan wasn't there for support. She was there to dominate their lives and profit from their kindness. Desperate for allies, Nina tried to discuss the situation with Evan, but found only shifting sand where she needed solid ground. "Mom's still grieving for Dad," Evan would say, using his father's death like a shield to deflect any criticism of his mother's invasive behavior. Nina felt control of her life slipping through her fingers like water. No matter how hard she tried to maintain her composure and show respect, living with Susan had become as impossible as trying to embrace a thorny rose without getting hurt. Each criticism, each interference, each unreasonable demand made Nina's desire to escape grow stronger, like a wild bird beating its wings against its cage. The arguments with Evan multiplied like storm clouds on the horizon. His persistent blindness to his mother's behavior and refusal to address it left Nina feeling as isolated as a lighthouse in a raging sea. What had once been her haven now felt like a maximum security prison, with Susan as her ever-vigilant warden. As days melted into weeks, mere discomfort evolved into unbearable torment. Susan's critical eye missed nothing, like a surveillance camera recording every perceived flaw. Everything became subject to her harsh judgment. From Nina's cooking to her choice of clothes, even the way she cared for Evan. "That blouse does nothing for your figure, dear," Susan would say without hesitation, her eyes sweeping critically over Nina's carefully chosen wardrobe like a fashion editor at a budget show. Her words, though disguised as concern, carried venom as deadly as a snake's bite. Initially, Nina tried to let these comments roll off her back like water from a duck's feathers, but as time passed, each barbed word found its mark. The proud, independent woman who had once taken such joy in her marriage and home began to question her every decision, like a dancer who suddenly forgets her well-rehearsed steps. Susan's criticism went beyond mere fault-finding, as she constantly reminded everyone how everything had been superior in Ronald's day, wielding her late husband's memory like a weapon. Ronald never had to settle for such a simple dinner, Susan declared one evening, watching Nina prepare a quick meal after an exhausting day at the office. Nina could only manage a tired smile, feeling the weight of judgment pressing down on her shoulders like a heavy winter coat. The precious bond between Nina and Evan began to fray like an old tapestry under Susan's relentless assault. Her criticism seemed craftily designed to drive a wedge between husband and wife, as precise as a surgeon's scalpel. Whenever Nina made a suggestion to her husband, Susan would interject with practiced timing, "Evan needs his rest, dear." Or she would hint darkly, "That's not really something he should be doing." When Nina tried to salvage their marriage by suggesting a weekend getaway, Susan pounced like a cat on an unsuspecting mouse. "Evan works so hard as it is," she proclaimed with manufactured concern. "He needs his rest, a trip would only exhaust him more," she added, her words falling like autumn leaves on Nina's hopes. The trip, like so many of Nina's attempts to reconnect with her husband, withered and died on the vine. As time marched forward like a relentless army, Nina felt her patience and self-esteem being crushed like delicate flowers under a heavy boot. She had lost herself in this maze of manipulation, unable to make even the simplest decisions in what was supposed to be her own home. The worst part was Evan's willful blindness to his mother's behavior, as solid as a brick wall between them. "Mom's just trying to help us," he would say, dismissing Nina's concerns as easily as brushing away a cobweb. Nina's isolation grew deeper with each passing day, as vast as the Grand Canyon and twice as empty. Evan's determination to avoid conflict with his mother only served to push Nina further into her solitary confinement. She yearned for Evan to understand, to truly see what was happening before his eyes. Yet Susan's criticism continued to escalate like a fever, spreading to every corner of Nina's existence. One morning, as Nina prepared to leave for work, Susan cornered her in the kitchen like a prosecutor approaching the witness stand. "Do you really need to work so much, Nina? Evan works too, you know. In my day, I stayed home and supported Ronald. I never had to work outside the home." The words struck Nina like arrows, each one targeting her cherished independence. It felt like Susan was trying to erase everything Nina had built for herself, like waves washing away a sandcastle. As days turned into weeks, Susan's presence became more suffocating than a humid summer day. Her criticism expanded beyond Nina's personal choices to include their financial decisions. One morning, after Evan had left for work, Susan delivered her latest demand with the precision of a seasoned negotiator. "In addition to the $500 I'm already receiving, I think you should give me another $500 monthly. After all, I do so much around here. I deserve compensation for my efforts." Nina stood speechless, as if the wind had been knocked from her lungs. Susan was supposed to be here for emotional support after Ronald's death, yet she was treating their home like a business venture. Though Nina had reached her breaking point, she found herself once again retreating into passive acceptance. She tried to explain that providing a home, meals, and love should be enough, but Susan remained unmoved. "I do far more than you realize," Susan insisted, her voice sharp as cut glass. "This house runs smoothly because of me. That deserves recognition, financial recognition." Desperate for support, Nina brought these concerns to Evan, hoping against hope that he would finally take a stand. But her hopes shattered like fine crystal against marble floors. Once again, Evan retreated into his familiar pattern of evasion. "Mom helps out a lot, Nina. I don't think her request is that unreasonable," he said, his voice as weak as autumn sunshine. Nina's frustration finally erupted like a long-dormant volcano. How could he be so blind to the absurdity of this situation? Yet once again, Evan chose the path of least resistance, avoiding any confrontation with his mother like a child avoiding the dark. The tension in their home grew thick as summer storm clouds, with arguments between Nina and Evan becoming as regular as sunrise. Every disagreement circled back to the same source. Susan, like a record stuck in an endless loop. Their marriage, once a sanctuary of peace and love, now trembled like a leaf in a storm, battered by this unwelcome intrusion. In the quiet moments of dawn, Nina found herself wrestling with haunting questions. How much longer can I endure this life? If Evan never finds the courage to change, what options do I have left? Most troubling of all was the uncertainty of how far Susan would push her controlling behavior. Every attempt to discuss Susan's domineering ways with Evan ended in the same frustrating dance. He remained paralyzed, unable or unwilling to confront his mother, like a statue frozen in time. In his eyes, Susan was nothing more than a vulnerable widow, and Nina's concerns were dismissed as lacking in empathy. Evan seemed determined to protect his mother at any cost, even if that meant sacrificing the harmony of his marriage. In one final attempt to bridge the widening chasm between them, Nina waited for Susan to leave on errands. She prepared coffee with trembling hands and asked Evan to join her at the kitchen table. Her heart pounding like a drum, she steeled herself for one last honest conversation. "Evan, we need to have a serious talk about your mother," she began, keeping her voice as steady as possible. "I understand she's going through a difficult time, but her presence has become unbearable. She criticizes everything I do, interferes with our lives, and now she's demanding more money. This isn't normal." Evan sighed heavily before she could finish, like a man carrying the weight of the world. "Nina, Mom lost her husband. She's trying to cope. We just need to be patient." "Patient?" Nina's voice cracked with disbelief. "I've been patient, Evan. This isn't just about grief anymore. She's controlling everything, and you're letting her." "That's not true," he mumbled, averting his eyes like he always did when conversations became uncomfortable. "I just don't want to hurt her. She's suffered enough." Nina felt something catch in her throat, a mixture of anger and despair. There it was, the invisible wall, as solid as steel and twice as cold. Evan's inability to confront his mother was destroying their marriage, yet he clung to his pattern of avoidance like a security blanket. "I'm suffering too. But you can't see that, can you? I'm your wife, Evan. This is our home, and I feel like a prisoner here. Constantly criticized, judged, and used." "You're exaggerating, Nina," Evan replied, blind to the gravity of the situation. "Mom just wants to help." His words struck Nina like a physical blow, leaving her breathless. The notion that Susan genuinely wanted to help seemed as absurd as snow in summer. Nina had felt the sting of every passive-aggressive comment, every calculated interference in their relationship, like poison slowly seeping into their marriage. Yet Evan, despite his love for Nina, remained bound to his mother by chains of blind loyalty as unbreakable as steel. The emotional toll on Nina was devastating, like watching a beautiful garden wither under relentless frost. She began to question the very foundation of her marriage, examining each crack and fissure with growing despair. Every attempt to explain her feelings to Evan met with the same wall of indifference, as if he'd grown weary of hearing the same song played too many times. Her happiness had become merely collateral damage in his mission to keep his mother content. Their marriage was crumbling before her eyes like a sandcastle against the rising tide. Each day felt heavier than the last, weighing on her shoulders like an invisible burden. The emotional exhaustion showed in every aspect of her being, leaving her perpetually drained. Then, on one suffocating afternoon, fate threw Nina an unexpected lifeline. As she emerged from the grocery store, arms laden with shopping bags, her mind wandered through the maze of her unbearable situation. Suddenly, a familiar voice cut through her thoughts like a ray of sunshine through storm clouds. Nina. She turned to find James, her former love from years ago, standing there as if conjured from her memories. Though time had left its gentle marks, he was still the same man she remembered. Calm, kind, with that soft smile that had once meant the world to her. In that moment, when her life seemed to be spinning out of control, seeing him felt like finding an anchor in a storm. A wave of nostalgia and relief washed over her, as powerful as the ocean tide. It was like stumbling upon a cherished photograph she'd forgotten existed, a snapshot of a happier time. They fell into conversation as naturally as autumn leaves drift to earth. James shared stories of his years abroad, recently returned from a life that seemed worlds away from Nina's current reality. He asked about her life, and though she hesitated at first, Nina found herself opening up like a flower to the morning sun. There was an ease to talking with James that she'd forgotten could exist. It felt like finding a well of trust in a desert of doubt, something she no longer experienced with anyone else. James stood in stark contrast to Evan and Susan. He was light where they were heavy, freedom where they were constraint. He represented a time when Nina had been happier, more carefree, more herself. Their conversation stretched on, neither wanting it to end, like the last warm day of summer. As they parted ways, Nina felt both relieved and unsettled, like a compass needle suddenly discovering a new magnetic north. The memories James had awakened created a painful contrast with her present reality. She found herself comparing her current life with what might have been, like holding up two photographs side by side. What did this mean for her future with Evan? She drove home that day with her mind swirling like autumn leaves in a whirlwind. For the first time in her life, she began to seriously question her choices. She started to wonder how much more of this situation she could endure. In the suffocating atmosphere of living with Susan and dealing with Evan's passive acceptance, her conversation with James became a breath of fresh air. After their unexpected reunion, they began exchanging messages. It started innocently enough, with light-hearted conversations about life and how things had changed. As time flowed like a gentle stream, Nina found herself increasingly drawn to the simple, light-hearted feeling James brought into her life. He was like a mirror reflecting her former self, the woman she used to be before drowning in the turbulent waters of her current life. Unlike the chaos she felt with Susan and Evan, conversations with James flowed as naturally as a summer breeze. With him, she felt truly heard, a sensation that had become as foreign in her own home as snow in July. In his presence, she could be herself without the weight of criticism or judgment pressing down on her shoulders. He never pushed, never pried, never demanded, his gentle approach was as refreshing as morning dew. This ethereal lightness drew Nina closer, like a moth to a welcoming flame. Their messages became the bright spots in her days, like stars appearing in an otherwise dark sky. She found herself eagerly anticipating their next exchange with the excitement of a schoolgirl. Through their conversations, Nina began to reconnect with her desire for a life of her own. James shared tales of his travels and experiences that seemed as distant from her suffocating reality as the moon from the earth. She surprised herself by daring to dream again, imagining a life where she could feel truly alive. Meanwhile, at home, the situation with Susan continued its downward spiral like a leaf caught in an autumn wind. Her mother-in-law's controlling behavior knew no bounds, and Nina had surrendered her will to argue back. She moved through her days like an automaton, trying in vain to ignore Susan's comments that stung like paper cuts. Her marriage to Evan had become a hollow shell of what it once was. The relationship that had once been her foundation now felt like quicksand beneath her feet. They barely spoke anymore, and discussions about Susan left them both exhausted and no closer to resolution. Finally, Nina stopped trying to have these conversations altogether, like a boxer throwing in the towel. Yet beneath her quiet exterior, she harbored a desperate thirst for change. Each conversation with James reminded her of the vibrant woman she used to be, like looking at an old photograph of happier times. Most significantly, she began to realize there could be life beyond her marriage to Evan and the suffocating existence with Susan. James wasn't necessarily the answer to her prayers. She wasn't looking to run away with him like a character in a romance novel. But his presence in her life symbolized freedom, like a key to a door she thought forever locked. During one conversation, James spoke words that penetrated her soul like arrows of truth. Life sometimes backs us into difficult corners, but there's always a way out. No matter how hard it seems. Those words resonated in Nina's heart like a bell-tolling truth. There's a way out. For the first time in recent memory, she believed it was possible. She realized the problem wasn't just Susan. It was Evan's passive acceptance of his mother's destruction of their marriage. If he couldn't see it, perhaps it was time for Nina to take control of her own destiny. One afternoon, after another fruitless argument with Evan, Nina left the house like a bird escaping its cage. She arranged to meet James at a quiet cafe, desperately needing a moment of peace away from the pressure cooker of her home. They sat across from each other at a small table, and as always, conversation flowed between them like a gentle stream. James brought laughter back into Nina's world, a sound she had almost forgotten existed in her own repertoire. The lightness she felt in his presence only emphasized the crushing weight she carried at home. As their coffee grew cold, Nina found herself pouring out her heart about Susan's suffocating presence and Evan's maddening passivity. She confessed how powerless she felt in her own home, controlled like a puppet on invisible strings. James listened with the patience of a confessor, never judging, never interrupting. When she finished, he offered just one simple yet profound observation: "Nina, everyone has the right to be happy. You don't have to live your life enduring pain." Those words struck her heart like a bell of truth, clear and resonant. She had a right to happiness. Something she had forgotten in her desperate attempts to be the perfect wife and keep peace with Susan. In her mission to please everyone else, she had lost the most important person, herself. James wasn't pushing her toward any hasty decisions. Yet his words planted a seed in Nina's mind, one that would grow into the realization that she didn't have to continue living this way. For days afterward, Nina wrestled with the decision before her, like a swimmer caught between two shores. Each new morning brought a stronger urge to voice everything she had been holding inside. Yet the courage to face Evan and bare her soul seemed as elusive as morning mist. The idea of ending her marriage, once unthinkable, now loomed before her like the only path out of the darkness. Meanwhile, Susan's criticism continued its relentless assault. One evening, as Nina returned home exhausted from work, Susan sat in the living room like a judge waiting to pass sentence. As Nina passed by, Susan's words cut through the air like a razor: "Always coming home so late, shouldn't you be taking better care of the house and Evan? This household needs more dedication from you." The words carved into Nina's heart like a knife. How dare she suggest Nina wasn't trying hard enough, when she had sacrificed everything, endured everything. It was the final straw that broke her already fragile composure. Nina retreated to her room without a word, struggling to hold herself together. That night, she sat at the kitchen table, watching Evan absorbed in his phone, acting as if their world wasn't crumbling around them. A mixture of sadness and anger swirled inside her like a gathering storm. Why couldn't he see what was happening right before his eyes? How could he ignore her suffering as if it were no more significant than the evening news? Nina felt the moment of truth had arrived, like a train pulling into its final station. She had to act before the situation destroyed what little sanity she had left. With a trembling voice but steely resolve, she finally broke the silence. "Evan, we need to talk. This time you really need to listen." Evan looked up, surprised by the gravity in her tone. "What is it now, Nina? Is this about Mom again?" "No," she replied. Nina drew in a deep breath like a diver preparing to plunge into dark waters. This is about her, but it's also about us. If you keep turning a blind eye to what's happening, then I need to spell it out clearly. Your mother is destroying our marriage. Evan sat in silence, like a statue frozen in time. He seemed lost for words, trapped in his lifelong aversion to conflict. Especially when it involved his mother. But this time, there was no escape route, no easy way out. She had to speak, and he had to listen. Since your mother moved in, my life has become a living hell, Nina continued, the words pouring out like a dam finally breaking. She criticizes everything I do, interferes with every decision we make, and you won't lift a finger to protect me. You always choose her side. And now she's demanding money for helping around the house. This isn't normal, Evan. Evan heaved a heavy sigh, discomfort written across his face like words on a page. Nina, how many times do we have to go through this? Mom's going through a rough time. She lost Dad, she's alone. We need to be patient. Patient? Nina echoed, her voice thick with disbelief. I've been patient enough, Evan. But everyone has their limits. This ends now. If you won't make a decision, if you won't set boundaries with her, then our marriage can't continue. Evan stared at her with bewilderment, as if she had suddenly started speaking in a foreign language. Are you giving me an ultimatum? I'm asking you to choose, Evan, Nina replied, tears glistening in her eyes like morning dew. I'll be clear, either you decide how to handle your mother, or we end this marriage. I love you, but I can't live like this anymore. This isn't my life. The shock hit Evan like a physical blow. He had known things were difficult with his mother, but he had never realized how close to the edge Nina had been pushed. He had believed time would heal all wounds, that living together would eventually fall into a natural rhythm. But now the situation had clearly spiraled beyond his control. Nina, He started, then fell silent, words failing him like leaves falling from an autumn tree. The conflict between his loyalty to his mother and his love for Nina was written clearly across his face. Yet he seemed incapable of making the firm decision she needed. In that moment, Nina saw with crystal clarity that Evan would never make the choice she desperately needed. If you can't find the courage to set boundaries with your mother, then I'll have to make the decision myself. As she spoke these words, Nina felt a mixture of sadness and relief wash over her like waves on a shore. It felt as if she had finally given herself permission to take the action she had needed all along. Evan sat in silence, his inner turmoil etched across his face like shadows at twilight. Nina knew with crushing certainty that he would do nothing. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but her marriage was over. Not because love had died, but because Evan lacked the courage to fight for their relationship, and Nina could no longer carry that burden alone. In the days that followed, Nina went through the motions of normality like an actress in a well-rehearsed play. Yet in her heart, she knew exactly what her next step must be. Her emotional exhaustion had reached its peak, leaving her unable to focus on anything else. That morning, as Nina rose from bed, she noticed the overwhelming weight she'd been carrying felt somehow lighter. This was different from her usual survival mode, where each day was merely about making it to the next. For the first time in what felt like forever, Nina sensed control over her own destiny. She understood that while her decision would bring pain, it was the only path to peace and a fresh start. While Evan still slept, she descended the stairs like a ghost in her own home. The house lay silent, Susan not yet stirring from her room. Nina seized this moment of tranquility, settling at the kitchen table with her coffee, planning her next move. She needed to find a way to leave without creating a storm of drama and conflict. She wanted no arguments, no heated discussions. Just forward motion. As she sipped her coffee, James's message appeared on her phone like a beacon in the darkness. It was a simple, how are you?" But to Nina, these words carried the weight of salvation. James had become her lifeline, a reminder that there was a world beyond her failed marriage and toxic relationship with Susan. Nina responded with raw honesty, "Today's the day I take action." James, understanding the gravity of her words, sent back simple encouragement without pressing for details. "I'm on your side, Nina. You deserve to be happy." This brief exchange infused her with courage like a shot of adrenaline. She couldn't postpone the final conversation with Evan any longer. She climbed the stairs again, entering their bedroom where Evan was preparing for work. He glanced at her, sensing something different in her demeanor, but said nothing. Nina steeled herself, waiting for him to finish dressing. Then, quietly, she began, "Evan, I need you to listen to something." Evan looked uncomfortable, avoiding her gaze like a child avoiding punishment. "Nina, I'm in a hurry. Can't this wait?" Nina shook her head with newfound determination. "No, Evan. This can't wait any longer. I've waited long enough." He sighed heavily, sinking onto the bed like a deflated balloon, preparing himself for whatever was coming. "What do you mean?" he asked, discomfort written across his face like a familiar story. Nina drew in a deep breath, steeling herself for the most difficult conversation of her life. Yet somehow, it would also be the most liberating. "I really tried, Evan. I tried everything to make our marriage work. But your mother is destroying what we have, and you're blind to it. I begged you to take a stand, to set boundaries. But you did nothing. So I've made my decision. I'm leaving." Evan sat in stunned silence, processing her words like a computer struggling with too much data. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of disbelief. "You're leaving because of Mom." Nina felt the pain in her chest but didn't hesitate. "Not just because of her, Evan. It's because you won't fight for us. You always choose the easy way out, avoiding every confrontation. And it's destroying what we have. I can't live like this anymore." Evan stared at her as if she were speaking a language he couldn't comprehend. He seemed to think this was just another argument that time would heal. But this time was different. Nina's resolve was as solid as granite. She knew that staying would mean a life filled with resentment and regret. "I'm packing my bags," Nina announced, rising to her feet like a phoenix from the ashes. "I'll be gone by tomorrow." Evan remained motionless, speechless, trying to grasp the reality unfolding before him. Perhaps somewhere in his heart, he had seen this coming. But like everything else, he had chosen to avoid facing it. Nina felt a complex mixture of relief and heartache washing over her like waves on a shore. Leaving the man she loved wouldn't be easy. But she knew with certainty that without change, their relationship was destined for destruction. As she began packing her clothes, memories of happier times with Evan flooded her mind like an old movie playing in reverse. Intimate moments they had shared, dreams they had built together. But these sweet memories were now overshadowed by pain, resentment, and Susan's overwhelming presence. This house had become toxic, a place where she could no longer be herself. With James, she had begun to envision a different future. A future where she could breathe deeply again, where happiness wasn't just a distant memory but a real possibility. Before her departure the next day, Nina faced one final confrontation with Susan. Her mother-in-law challenged her decision with characteristic self-righteousness. "Are you really leaving? How could you do something so foolish? Nina, you're abandoning Evan. He needs you." But Susan's words, once so powerful, now fell like empty shells at Nina's feet. "I'm not abandoning anyone, Susan. I'm saving myself." Susan no longer held any power over her, like a spell that had finally been broken. Nina had made her choice, and no amount of manipulation could shake her resolve. Evan stood in the doorway, his expression still clouded with confusion, watching as Nina carried her bags to the waiting car. She walked out with the quiet confidence of someone who knew they were doing the right thing. With James by her side, Nina felt the weight of years lifting from her shoulders like a heavy coat she no longer needed to wear. This wasn't a fairy tale ending with swelling music and romantic promises. Instead, it was something more profound. A new beginning. Nina knew the path ahead was uncertain, like a road disappearing into morning mist. Yet for the first time in years, she felt truly in control of her own destiny. Though emotional scars remained, like battle wounds that would take time to heal, Nina was ready to begin her new life. She had shed the constraints of her suffocating marriage and reached for freedom like a bird taking flight. With James nearby, hope bloomed in her heart like the first flower of spring. Ahead lay a future full of possibilities, beyond the broken chains of her past. At last, Nina's freedom awaited, like a sunrise breaking through storm clouds.